The rain fell in sheets against the mullioned windows of Thornfield Manor, each droplet racing downward like tears against glass. Lady Catherine Ashworth stood in the conservatory, her blonde hair pinned elaborately beneath a lace cap, her pale blue dress rustling as she trembled. The letter in her hands bore her father's seal, and the words upon it had drained all color from her already porcelain complexion. She had read it 3 times now, hoping each time that the meaning would somehow change, that the elegant script would rearrange itself into something less monstrous. But the words remained unchanged. She was to marry the Duke of Blackmore within the month. The Duke, a man of 62 years, known throughout the county for his vast wealth, his cruel temperament, and his tendency to go through wives as another man might go through riding crops. Catherine's hands shook as she lowered the letter. Through the conservatory glass, she could see the servants' quarters across the garden courtyard, and she thought of Thomas. Sweet, gentle Thomas, who worked in the stables and tended the grounds. Thomas, whose rough hands had held hers in secret moments stolen behind the rose garden wall. Thomas, whose kisses tasted of hope and impossible dreams. They had known their love was forbidden from the start. She was the daughter of an earl educated in Paris, accomplished in all the feminine arts. He was the son of a blacksmith, employed at Thornfield out of her father's charity after his own father had drunk himself to death. The gulf between them was as wide as the ocean, as uncrossable as the distance between earth and stars. And yet they had loved. Catherine pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching the rain, remembering. She remembered the first time she had truly seen Thomas, not as part of the anonymous mass of servants, but as a man. It had been spring 2 years ago, and she had been walking through the gardens with her sketchpad. She had come upon him repairing a section of the garden wall. His shirt sleeves rolled up, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he worked. He had looked up at her reproach, and their eyes had met, and in that moment, something had shifted in the very foundation of her world. The first conversation had been innocent enough. He had apologized for blocking her path. She had asked about the wall, about the roses he was training along it. His voice had been educated beyond his station. He had taught himself to read. He later told her, from books borrowed from the manor library when no one was looking. They had talked for an hour that day, and every day after that, she had found excuses to walk in the gardens at the same time. The friendship had deepened slowly, carefully, like roots growing in secret darkness. He had shared with her his thoughts on the books he read, his dreams of a different life. She had shown him her sketches, had laughed with him in a way she never laughed in the drawing rooms of her father's guests. And then one day, behind the rose garden wall, where no one could see, he had kissed her. It had been the most terrifying and wonderful moment of her life. For 2 years, they had conducted their impossible romance in shadows and silence. They had met in the conservatory late at night when the household slept. They had exchanged letters, hidden in the hollow of an old oak tree at the edge of the property. They had built a world of two, knowing it could never survive the light of day, but cherishing it all the same. And now her father had destroyed it with a single letter. Catherine heard footsteps behind her and turned to find her maid, Susan, entering the conservatory. The older woman's face was troubled. "My lady," Susan said quietly, Your father wishes to see you in his study. Catherine folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her sleeve. Thank you, Susan. Tell him I will come directly. As Susan departed, Catherine took a moment to compose herself. She knew what her father would say. He would speak of duty, of family honor, of the financial difficulties that plagued Thornfield Manor, her brother's gambling debts, her mother's expensive tastes, the poor harvests of recent years. All of it had combined to leave the Ashworth family teetering on the edge of ruin. The Duke of Blackmore's offer had been generous enough to save them all. And all it would cost was Catherine's life. She found her father in his study, standing by the window with a glass of brandy in his hand. The Earl of Thornfield was a tall man, gone slightly to fat in his middle years, with thinning grey hair and a permanent expression of dissatisfaction. He did not turn as Catherine entered. "You've read the letter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, father." "The Duke has been most accommodating. The settlements are extremely favorable. Your mother is already planning the wedding breakfast." Catherine's hands clenched at her sides. "Father, I must speak with you about—" "There is nothing to discuss, Catherine." Now he did turn, and his face was hard. "You are my daughter, and you will do your duty to this family. We are on the brink of bankruptcy. Your brother's debts alone could see us in debtor's prison. The Duke's wealth will secure our future." "But, father, he is 40 years my senior. They say he mistreated his last wife, that she died under mysterious—" "They say many things," her father interrupted sharply. "Most of it idle gossip from people with nothing better to do than malign their betters. The Duke is a peer of the realm, a man of property and standing. You should be grateful for such an advantageous match." Catherine felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I will not be grateful for being sold like cattle at market." Her father's hand cracked across her face before she even saw it coming. The blow sent her stumbling backward, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. She stared at him in shock. He had never struck her before. "You will watch your tongue," the Earl said coldly, "and you will prepare yourself to receive the Duke when he calls tomorrow. He wishes to meet his bride and discuss the arrangements. I expect you to be charming and obedient." Catherine said nothing. She simply turned and fled the study, her vision blurred with tears. She ran through the corridors of Thornfield Manor, past startled servants, up the stairs to her chambers. Once inside, she locked the door and collapsed onto her bed, letting the sobs come at last. She cried until she had no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and her throat raw. When the storm of weeping finally passed, she lay still, staring at the canopy above her bed, feeling hollowed out and numb. There was a soft tapping at her window. Catherine sat up confused. Her room was on the second floor. No one could reach the window without a ladder. But the tapping came again, more insistent, and she rose on shaking legs to investigate. Thomas's face appeared at the window, pale in the moonlight that had emerged from behind the storm clouds. He was balanced precariously on the thick wisteria vine that grew up the manor's wall, and he was gesturing urgently for her to open the window. Catherine quickly unlatched it, and Thomas climbed through, dropping lightly onto the floor of her bedroom. It was wildly improper, dangerous beyond measure. But Catherine threw herself into his arms without thought. "Catherine," he whispered, holding her tightly. "Susan told me. She told me about the letter." Catherine pulled back just enough to look at him. Thomas was 24, just 2 years her senior, with dark hair that never quite stayed combed and grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. His face was handsome in a rough way, marked by a small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. His clothes were simple, a servant's rough shirt and trousers, worn but clean. "It's true," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "My father has promised me to the Duke of Blackmore. The wedding is to be in 1 month." She saw something shift in Thomas's eyes, something dark and dangerous that she had never seen there before. His hands, which had been gentle on her arms, tightened until they almost hurt. "No," he said flatly. "No, I won't allow it. Thomas, there is nothing we can do. My father has made his decision. If I refuse, my entire family will be ruined." "Then let them be ruined," Thomas said fiercely. "Catherine, you cannot marry that man. I have heard the talk among the servants." The Duke's last wife died after less than a year of marriage, covered in bruises. The one before her fled to a convent to escape him. "He is a monster." "I know." Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. "But what choice do I have?" Thomas's jaw clenched. He was silent for a long moment, and Catherine could see thoughts racing behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled, but somehow that made it more frightening. "There is always a choice," he said. "Will the Duke visit before the wedding?" "Tomorrow. He comes tomorrow to meet me and discuss the arrangements." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I have time." Time for what? But Thomas only kissed her, deeply and desperately, pouring into it all the love and fear and fury that words could not contain. When he pulled away, his eyes were blazing. "Trust me," he said. "I'll not let him take you. I swear it on my life, Catherine. You will not marry the Duke of Blackmore." Before Catherine could respond, before she could ask what he meant, Thomas had climbed back through the window and disappeared into the night, descending the wisteria vine like a ghost. Catherine stood at the open window, the cool night air washing over her, and felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope or might have been dread. She could not tell which. The Duke of Blackmore arrived precisely at noon the following day, in a gleaming black carriage drawn by 4 perfectly matched horses. Catherine watched from her bedroom window as he emerged. A tall, angular man dressed in expensive black clothing that made him look like a carrion bird. Even from this distance, she could see the coldness in his bearing, the way the servants scurried out of his path like mice before a cat. Her maid had dressed her in her finest gown, a cream silk affair with delicate lace at the throat and sleeves. Her blonde hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure, and her face had been powdered to hide the redness from yesterday's tears. She looked, she thought numbly, exactly like a doll prepared for display. The meeting took place in the grand drawing room. Catherine's mother was there, all nervous smiles and flattering words. Her father stood by the fireplace, looking satisfied and prosperous. And the Duke looked at Catherine the way a man might look at a horse he was considering purchasing. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they traveled over her body with clinical assessment. He did not smile. "Lady Catherine," he said, and his voice was like dry leaves scraping across stone, "you are as lovely as your father promised. Turn around, if you please." Catherine felt her mother's warning touch on her arm, and she obeyed, turning slowly. She felt the Duke's eyes on her back, judging her figure, her posture, her value. When she faced him again, she saw the slight nod of approval he gave her father. "She will do nicely," the Duke said, as if Catherine were not even present. "The wedding will take place at my estate. I have already sent for the bishop. Your daughter will, of course, reside at Blackmore Hall after the ceremony. I find it best to separate young wives from their families. It helps them adjust to their new duties more quickly." Catherine's mother made some murmuring response, but Catherine barely heard it. She was staring at the Duke's hands. Long, thin fingers with carefully manicured nails. Hands that would soon have the right to touch her whenever they pleased, however they pleased. The thought made her stomach turn. "I trust the girl is innocent," the Duke said suddenly, his cold eyes fixing on Catherine's father. "I have no use for soiled goods." "My daughter is a virtuous maiden," the Earl said stiffly, and Catherine saw the flash of anger in his eyes at the insult, quickly suppressed. They needed the Duke's money too badly to afford pride. The Duke nodded. "Good. I shall expect her to be obedient, modest, and fertile. My first two wives proved barren, to my great disappointment. I trust your daughter will do better." He stood then, clearly considering the interview concluded. "I will send the marriage contracts by courier tomorrow. See that everything is prepared. I expect my bride to arrive at Blackmore Hall no later than the 20th of the month." And with that, he was gone, sweeping out of the drawing room in a rustle of expensive fabric. Catherine heard the front door close, the carriage pull away, and only then did she allow herself to breathe. Her mother immediately began chattering about wedding preparations, about the trousseau that would need to be assembled, the guests to be invited. Her father poured himself a celebratory brandy. Neither of them seemed to notice that Catherine had not said a single word during the entire interview. As soon as she could escape, Catherine fled to the gardens. She went to the old oak tree at the edge of the property, to the hollow where she and Thomas left their secret messages. Her hand shook as she reached inside. There was a note written in Thomas's careful hand. "I have a plan. Meet me in the conservatory tonight at midnight. Trust me, my love. I will save you." Catherine clutched the note to her chest, her heart pounding. She should be afraid of what Thomas might be planning. She should discourage him, should accept her fate with resignation. But all she could feel was a fierce, desperate hope. That night, Catherine lay in her bed fully dressed, watching the hands of her bedside clock crawl toward midnight. When the hour finally struck, she rose silently and made her way through the darkened corridors of Thornfield Manor to the conservatory. Thomas was already there, waiting among the shadows and moonlight-silvered plants. He pulled her into his arms the moment she appeared, and for a long moment they simply held each other. "What is your plan?" Catherine finally whispered. "Thomas, what are you going to do?" Thomas pulled back to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was set with grim determination. "I am going to Blackmore Hall." Catherine's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "The Duke needs servants. He lost several staff members recently. They left rather than continue serving him. I heard the housekeeper at the Duke's London residence is desperate to hire replacements before he returns to Blackmore Hall. I will present myself as an experienced footman seeking employment." "But, Thomas, you're a groundskeeper, not a footman. They'll never believe—" "I can play the part well enough," Thomas interrupted. "Catherine, I've been practicing. I've watched the footmen here, learned their mannerisms, their way of speaking. I can do this. Catherine felt cold dread settling in her stomach. And once you're employed at Blackmore Hall? What then? Thomas's eyes grew darker. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. In the moonlight, it looked like water, innocent and harmless. But Catherine knew better. Thomas, no, she breathed. You can't mean... The Duke is an evil man, Thomas said, his voice hard. He has destroyed wives before you, Catherine. He will destroy you too, if we let him. This is the only way. Catherine stared at the vial, horrified and transfixed. What is it? Hemlock extract. It will cause gradual decline, like a natural illness. No one will suspect murder. The Duke is old, and his health is reportedly poor. A sudden death will be seen as unfortunate but not surprising. Thomas, if you're caught, they'll hang you. They'll hang you for murder. Thomas stuck the vial back into his coat and took her hands. I won't be caught. I'm careful, Catherine. I'm clever. And I love you more than I fear death. But this is... Catherine's voice broke. This is killing a man. This is murder. This is saving your life, Thomas said fiercely. Catherine, listen to me. If you marry the Duke, you will suffer. You will be beaten, humiliated, broken. And eventually, like his other wives, you will die. I cannot. I will not let that happen. I would rather damn my soul 1,000 times over than watch you go to that fate. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. Everything about this was wrong, twisted, monstrous. But when she thought of the Duke's cold eyes, his cruel hands, the certain misery that awaited her at Blackmore Hall, she could not bring herself to refuse Thomas's terrible offer. If you do this, she whispered, there will be no going back. Your soul, your conscience, are a small price to pay for your safety. Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I knew what I was when I fell in love with you, Catherine. I knew I could never have you, never marry you, never give you the life you deserved. But I can give you this. I can give you freedom from that monster. Catherine closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the dark devotion in his words. It was terrible. It was beautiful. It was utterly mad. Promise me, she said, opening her eyes to meet his. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't be caught. I promise, Thomas said, and sealed it with a kiss. They held each other in the moonlit conservatory until nearly dawn, neither wanting to let go, both knowing that when Thomas left Thornfield Manor to seek employment at Blackmore Hall, everything would change. They were crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. When the first light began to creep over the horizon, Thomas kissed her one final time and disappeared into the grey morning. Catherine watched him go, then returned to her room and collapsed onto her bed, her mind whirling with horror and hope and a terrible, creeping guilt. 3 days later, Catherine received a brief note, delivered by a traveling peddler who regularly brought goods to Thornfield Manor. The note was unsigned, but she knew Thomas's handwriting immediately. I have been hired. The Duke returns to Blackmore Hall next week. I will write when I can. Catherine burned the note immediately, then spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious distraction. Her mother attributed it to bridal nerves and plied her with soothing tea and endless talk of wedding preparations. Catherine barely heard any of it. The days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Catherine went through the motions of her daily life, embroidering with her mother, receiving visits from neighboring ladies who came to offer congratulations on her upcoming marriage, sitting for fittings as the seamstress prepared her trousseau. All the while, her mind was with Thomas at Blackmore Hall, wondering what he was doing, whether he had found an opportunity to act. She tried not to think about what was actually happening there. She tried not to imagine Thomas slipping poison into the Duke's evening brandy, watching him drink it, serving him day after day, while the hemlock did its slow, terrible work. But the images came anyway, unbidden, filling her dreams with darkness. 2 weeks after Thomas had left, on a grey afternoon that threatened rain, Catherine's father summoned her to his study once again. His face was strange when she entered, shocked, uncertain, perhaps even slightly relieved. "Catherine," he said slowly, "I have just received most extraordinary news. The Duke of Blackmore is dead." Catherine felt the room spin. She gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. "Dead?" Her voice came out strangled. "How?" "A sudden illness, apparently. He had been complaining of headaches and nausea for several days. His physician believed it to be influenza. Yesterday, he took a turn for the worse, and by this morning, he had expired." Her father poured himself a brandy with shaking hands. "This is most unfortunate. The marriage settlements were not yet finalized, so we will receive nothing from his estate. We are back where we started, financially speaking." Catherine barely heard him. Her mind was reeling. Thomas had done it. He had actually done it. The Duke was dead, and she was free. But the freedom felt like ashes in her mouth. Over the following weeks, more details emerged. The Duke's death had been attributed to a sudden viral illness that had swept through Blackmore Hall, affecting several members of the staff as well. The physician had seen nothing suspicious. The Duke was buried with full honors in the family crypt, mourned by no one who had actually known him. Thomas did not return. Catherine waited, checking the hollow in the oak tree every day, but there were no messages. She began to fear the worst, that he had been caught somehow, that he was imprisoned or worse. The fear gnawed at her constantly, a sick anxiety that she had to hide behind a mask of mourning for her lost betrothal. The weeks stretched into a month, then 2 months. Catherine's father, relieved of the immediate pressure, but still facing financial difficulties, began hinting about other potential matches. Catherine barely listened. She moved through her days like a ghost, present, but not truly there. Her mind always searching for some sign, some word from Thomas. Then, 6 weeks after the Duke's death, Thomas finally came. Catherine was in the conservatory, as she was most evenings now, staring out at the darkening gardens. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find him standing there, thin and pale and travel-worn, but alive. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with a sob of relief. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I thought you were dead," Catherine finally whispered. "I thought they had caught you." "No," Thomas said quietly. "I was careful, just as I promised. But I couldn't leave Blackmore Hall immediately. It would have looked suspicious. I had to stay until the household was dispersed, until I could leave with the other servants who were let go after the Duke's death." Catherine pulled back to look at him. He looked older somehow, harder. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before, and something in his expression that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Tell me everything." Thomas led her to a bench hidden among the plants where they could not be seen from the house. His voice was flat, emotionless, as he recounted the events at Blackmore Hall. "The Duke arrived at the hall 3 days after I was hired. He was exactly as terrible as we had feared. Cruel to the servants, arbitrary in his punishments. I saw him strike a maid for bringing his tea too hot. I watched him berate the housekeeper until she wept." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "Knowing what he would have done to you, Catherine, it made what I had to do easier. I was assigned to serve at his table, to bring his meals, his wine. It was simple to add a few drops of the hemlock extract to his brandy each evening. Not enough to kill him immediately, but enough to make him gradually ill." "Did he suffer?" Catherine asked, and then hated herself for asking. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "He suffered. The headaches came first, then the nausea. He became weak, confused. In his final days, he had seizures. The physician was baffled. He attributed it to some unknown fever. I was there when he died, standing by the door of his chamber. He looked at me, Catherine. I think in that last moment he knew. He knew what I had done, but it was too late." Catherine felt bile rising in her throat. She had wanted the Duke dead, had been grateful for Thomas's intervention, but hearing the reality of it, the suffering, the slow deterioration, the terror in those final moments, made her stomach turn. "Thomas, Don't," Thomas interrupted. "Don't tell me you're sorry, or that you feel guilty. This was my choice, Catherine, my sin to bear. You're free now. That is all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered, Catherine realized. Because looking at Thomas now, at the man who had killed for her, she saw the cost of that freedom written in every line of his face. He had damned himself to save her, and that damnation had changed him into something darker, harder, more haunted than the gentle gardener she had fallen in love with. And worse, she realized with creeping horror, was that she was grateful. She was free and alive, and not married to a monster. Whatever guilt she felt was overshadowed by relief. What did that make her? What did it say about her soul that she could be glad of murder? "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something break in his expression, a terrible sadness mixed with resignation. "I cannot stay at Thornfield Manor. Questions might be asked, connections might be made. I have saved some money over the years. I thought I might go to London, or perhaps Liverpool, find work in a place where no one knows me." "And us?" Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. "What of us, Thomas?" The pain that crossed Thomas's face nearly broke her heart. "There can be no us, Catherine. You are a noble woman. I am a servant. I am also now a murderer. Even if society would allow us to be together, which it never would, how could I ask you to tie yourself to such a man? How could I ask you to love a killer?" "But I do love you," Catherine said desperately. "That hasn't changed." "Everything has changed," Thomas said, and his voice was infinitely sad. "I have blood on my hands, Catherine. The Duke was evil, yes, but I still took a human life. I still ended a man's existence through slow poison, watching him suffer day after day. That stain will never wash away. I see him in my dreams, you know. Every night I see his face, in those final moments, the terror and realization in his eyes." He stood, and Catherine stood with him, clutching at his arms. "Thomas, please, don't leave me. We can find a way." "There is no way," Thomas said gently. He took her face in his hands one last time, memorizing her features in the fading light. "You will go on, Catherine. Your father will find you another match, one more suitable. You will marry, have children, live the life you were meant to live. And I will carry the memory of your love and the knowledge that I saved you, and that will have to be enough." "It's not enough," Catherine sobbed. "It's not fair." "Love rarely is," Thomas said. He kissed her forehead tender and final. "Goodbye, Catherine. Be happy. Please, for my sake, be happy." "How can I be happy without you?" she whispered. "You must try, because if you're not happy, if the life I bought for you with my soul is filled with misery, then what was the point? What did I damn myself for?" The logic was twisted, terrible, but Catherine understood it. Thomas needed to believe that his sacrifice had been worth it. He needed to know that she would go on, that she would find some measure of joy in the freedom he had given her. It was the only way he could bear the weight of what he had done. "I'll try," Catherine whispered. "I promise. I'll try." Thomas smiled then, a sad, broken smile that would haunt her for the rest of her life. He kissed her one last time, not with passion, but with grief and goodbye. And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the gardens, leaving Catherine alone among the plants and shadows of the conservatory. She sank onto the bench and wept until she had no tears left, mourning not just the loss of Thomas, but the loss of the innocent love they had once shared. That love had been pure and bright and impossible. What they had now was something twisted, born of violence and desperation, stained with blood that could never be washed clean. The months that followed were grey and empty. Catherine went through the motions of her life, but nothing seemed real. She attended church services and heard sermons about sin and redemption. And she wondered if there could be redemption for what she and Thomas had done. She had not wielded the poison herself, but she had known. She had consented. She was complicit. Her father, somewhat relieved of the immediate financial pressure by her brother's sudden decision to reform his gambling habits and marry an heiress, did not immediately seek another match for her. For a time, she was allowed to simply exist, neither mourned nor celebrated, floating in a strange limbo between her old life and whatever came next. She thought about Thomas constantly. She wondered where he was, whether he had found work, whether the guilt weighed on him as heavily as it weighed on her. She wondered if he slept at night, or if the Duke's face haunted his dreams as it sometimes haunted hers. Those cold, colorless eyes, that expression of realization in the moment before death. Most of all, she felt guilty for still loving him. She should have been horrified by what he had done. She should have turned away from him in disgust, but she couldn't. Even knowing what he was capable of, even understanding the darkness that lurked beneath his gentle exterior, she loved him still. What did that say about her own darkness? 1 year after the Duke's death, a letter arrived at Thornfield Manor, addressed to Lady Catherine Ashworth. There was no return address, and the handwriting was deliberately disguised. But Catherine knew immediately who it was from. Her hands trembled as she took it to the conservatory, to the bench where she and Thomas had said goodbye. She opened it with shaking fingers. "My dearest Catherine, I pray this letter finds you well, and that you will forgive the presumption of my writing. I know I should not, that it is dangerous for both of us. But I find I cannot bear the silence any longer. I'm in Liverpool now, working at the docks. It is hard labor, but honest, and it keeps me occupied. The physical exhaustion helps in its way. It gives me dreamless sleep on the nights when my conscience would otherwise keep me awake. I have lodgings in a boarding house near the waterfront. The room is small and plain, but it is mine, and there are no ghosts here except the ones I brought with me. I think of you every day. I think of what we had, what we lost, what we can never have. The guilt is a constant companion. Not guilt for killing the Duke. For that I would do again in a heartbeat if it meant saving you. But guilt for the burden I have placed upon your conscience. You were never meant to carry such darkness, Catherine. You were meant for sunshine and happiness and love without shadows. I have heard through mutual acquaintances — do not worry, I was discreet in my inquiries — that your father is considering matches for you again. I hope he chooses well this time. I hope he finds you a man who is young and kind and worthy of you. I hope you will allow yourself to love again, to be happy. You deserve happiness, Catherine, more than anyone I have ever known. As for me, I do not expect happiness. I do not deserve it. But I have something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that you are safe, that you are free, that somewhere in the world you are alive and well because of what I did. That knowledge sustains me, even in my darkest moments. The men I work with at the docks are rough, simple men. They drink and fight and love with an honesty I envy. They do not carry the weight of sin as I do. Sometimes I think about confessing what I have done, not to the authorities, but to a priest, to God, to anyone who might offer absolution. But I know there can be no forgiveness for what I have done. I took a life with premeditation and malice. That I did it for love does not excuse it. That the victim was evil does not pardon it. I should not say I love you still, for it is unfair to us both. But I cannot lie to you, Catherine. I have never been able to lie to you. I love you. I will always love you. And if, in another life, we had been born to different circumstances, if I had been a gentleman and you had been free to choose, I believe we could have been happy together. But this is the life we have, and we must make what we can of it. Be well, my darling. Be happy. And if you can, forgive me. Not for killing the Duke, but for loving you so much that I was willing to become a monster to save you. Yours eternally. T. Catherine read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her bodice. Over her heart, where it would remain hidden but always present. She did not write back. It would be too dangerous, too foolish. But she kept the letter, carrying it with her always, a tangible reminder of the love that had damned them both, and the terrible price that had been paid for her freedom. 2 years after the Duke's death, Catherine's father arranged another match for her. This time, it was to a baronet, Sir William Hertford, a pleasant man of 35 with a kind face and gentle manner. He was neither wealthy nor particularly distinguished, but he was respectable, solvent, and most importantly, genuinely kind. He courted Catherine properly, with flowers and poetry and respectful attention. He never once looked at her the way the Duke had, as if she were property to be assessed and acquired. He spoke to her as if her opinions mattered, as if she were a person rather than an ornament. He made her laugh, something she had not done in the 2 years since Thomas had left. Catherine accepted his proposal because it was expected of her, because her father needed the alliance, because she could not mourn forever, and perhaps, in some small way, because Thomas had asked her to be happy, and this seemed like the best chance she had at some approximation of happiness. On her wedding day, she wore white and smiled at all the appropriate moments and said her vows in a clear, steady voice. The church was filled with well-wishers, the breakfast was elegant, the celebration lasted well into the evening. Everyone said what a lovely bride she made, how fortunate Sir William was to have secured such a prize. But beneath her wedding gown, hidden against her skin, she wore Thomas's letter. Sir William proved to be a good husband, perhaps even a great one, by the standards of their time. He was patient with her, considerate, affectionate without being demanding. He never raised his voice to her, never raised his hand. He gave her a comfortable home in the countryside, beautiful gardens that reminded her painfully of Thornfield, and eventually 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Catherine did her best to love him, to be a good wife. And in her own way, she succeeded. She managed his household efficiently, entertained his guests gracefully, raised their children with devotion. She shared his bed without complaint, and even found moments of contentment in his arms, though it was a pale, quiet thing compared to the fierce passion she had known with Thomas. Sir William never knew that his wife's heart was divided. He never knew that she carried another man's letter next to her skin, that she thought of a poor servant every time she walked through her gardens, that sometimes in the night she woke from dreams of grey eyes and gentle hands stained with blood. The years passed, and Catherine grew into her role. She became Lady Hertford, respected in the community, known for her charitable works and gracious manner. She was a devoted mother who sang lullabies to her children and taught them to read before they went away to school. She was a supportive wife who listened to her husband's concerns about the estate and offered thoughtful counsel. To the outside world, she was the picture of domestic felicity. But late at night, when her husband slept beside her and the house was silent, Catherine would sometimes take out Thomas's letter and read it by candlelight. She would remember the feel of his hands, the taste of his kisses, the terrible, beautiful devotion that had led him to commit murder for her sake. And she would cry silent tears for the love they had lost, for the innocence that could never be recovered, for the price that had been paid in blood and souls. She never heard from Thomas again. As the years went by, she wondered if he was still alive, still working at the Liverpool docks, still carrying the weight of what he had done. She wondered if he had found some measure of peace, or if the guilt haunted him until his last breath. She wondered if he ever thought of her, or if he had managed to move on, to build some semblance of a life without her. She would never know. 5 years into her marriage, Catherine made a pilgrimage of sorts. She told her husband she was visiting a school friend in Liverpool, and took the train to that grey, industrial city by the sea. She walked along the docks, searching the faces of the labourers, hoping against hope that she might catch a glimpse of Thomas. She didn't find him. The docks were vast, teeming with thousands of workers, and she realized the futility of her search. But she spent an hour watching the ships come and go, imagining Thomas somewhere among the crowds, lifting cargo, his hands rough with honest labor, his soul heavy with the weight of murder. Before she left Liverpool, she went to a church, not the grand cathedral in the city centre, but a small, humble chapel near the docks where workers might go to pray. She lit a candle for Thomas, wherever he was, and whispered a prayer for his soul. She didn't know if God heard prayers for murderers, but she prayed anyway. When she returned home, her husband asked about her friend, and Catherine lied smoothly, describing imaginary conversations and a house she had never seen. The lie came easily, and she realized with a mixture of shame and resignation that she had become quite good at lying over the years. She lied about her past, about her feelings, about the darkness she carried inside her. She lied to protect the life she had built, the life Thomas had bought for her with poison and damnation. 10 years after the Duke's death, Catherine's eldest daughter came of age and began receiving suitors. Watching her daughter navigate the complex world of courtship, Catherine felt a fierce, protective love rise up in her. She was determined that her daughter would marry for love, or at least for mutual respect and affection. She would not allow her child to be sold to some cruel old man, as she nearly had been. When her daughter expressed interest in a young clergyman with more piety than wealth, Catherine supported the match despite her husband's initial hesitation. She argued passionately for the young man's character, his kindness, his genuine devotion to her daughter. In the end, Sir William relented, and the wedding was celebrated with joy rather than resignation. As Catherine watched her daughter exchange vows with her chosen partner, she thought of Thomas. This happiness, this freedom to choose, had been purchased with the Duke's life. Every smile, every moment of joy her daughter experienced was built on a foundation of murder. The thought should have horrified her, but instead she felt only a grim satisfaction. The Duke had been a monster, and his death had prevented untold suffering. She told herself this often in the dark hours of the night. She told herself that Thomas had been right, that it had been necessary, that some lives were worth less than others. She built elaborate justifications in her mind, complex moral arguments that allowed her to live with what had been done. But deep down, in a place she rarely allowed herself to examine, she knew the truth. She was complicit in murder, and no amount of subsequent happiness could change that fact. Her soul was stained, just as Thomas's was, and they would both carry that stain to their graves and beyond. 15 years after the Duke's death, Catherine was sitting in her garden when a stranger approached. He was an older man, weathered and grey, with the look of someone who had worked hard all his life. He asked to speak with Lady Hertford on a matter of some delicacy. Catherine's heart began to race. She dismissed the servants and invited the man to sit. "My lady," he said, his voice rough with a northern accent. "I knew a man once in Liverpool. Thomas Blackwell he called himself, though I don't think that was his real name. He worked at the docks for many years. Good worker, kept to himself mostly." Catherine's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he died 3 months ago, my lady. Fell from a crane, broke his neck. It was quick, they said. He didn't suffer." Catherine felt the world tilt. Thomas was dead. After all these years of wondering, of hoping, he was gone. "Before he died," the man continued, "he gave me something. Said if anything happened to him, I was to find Lady Catherine Hertford, formerly Lady Catherine Ashworth of Thornfield Manor, and give it to her. Took me a while to track you down, my lady, but I'm a man of my word. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Catherine took it with trembling hands. He was a good man, the stranger said, haunted-like, but good. Whatever he'd done in his past, he tried to make up for it. He gave half his wages to the widows and orphans, helped anyone who needed it. The men respected him. When he died, half the docks came to his funeral. The man stood. I'll be going now, my lady. I'm sorry for your loss. Catherine barely heard him leave. She sat in the garden, clutching the package, tears streaming down her face. Thomas was dead. He had lived 15 more years, working at the docks, trying to atone for what he had done. And now he was gone, and she hadn't even known. With shaking hands, she unwrapped the package. Inside was a single letter, written in Thomas's familiar hand, and a pressed rose. One of the white roses from Thornfield's garden, carefully preserved all these years. Catherine opened the letter. My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, then I am dead. I cannot say I'm sorry. Death will be a relief from the burden I have carried this 15 years. I want you to know that I have lived a decent life here in Liverpool. I have worked hard, helped where I could, tried to be a good man, despite what I did. But every day, every single day, I have thought of you. I have wondered if you were happy, if you found the joy I wanted so desperately to give you. I have never regretted killing the Duke. That man deserved to die, and if I had it to do over again, I would. But I do regret the burden I placed upon your soul. I do regret that our love, which should have been pure and beautiful, became something dark and twisted. I regret that we could not be together, that I had to leave you, that this was the only life we could have. I have made my peace with God, as much as a man like me can. I have confessed my sins to a priest who listened without judgment. He told me that love, even love that leads to terrible acts, can be a path to redemption if we use it to become better people. I hope he was right. I hope that when I stand before the Almighty, He will see that I acted out of love, and that love will count for something. I'm including a rose from Thornfield, one I took with me when I left, pressed between the pages of a book. I have kept it all these years as a reminder of what we had before everything went dark. I want you to have it back now. Let it be a symbol of the innocent love we once shared before murder and guilt and separation. Live well, Catherine. Love your husband if you can. Love your children fiercely. Build a good life on the foundation I gave you, bloodstained though it may be. And know that somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, I will be waiting for you, hoping that we might finally be together without shadows between us. You were the best thing in my life, Catherine. You were worth everything, worth the guilt, the loneliness, the damnation. If I have a soul, it belongs to you. It always has. Yours in death, as I was in life. Thomas. Catherine read the letter 3 times, tears falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. Then she held the pressed rose to her lips and wept for the man who had loved her so completely, so destructively, so devotedly, that he had been willing to become a monster for her sake. That night, she told her husband she was feeling ill, retired early to her chambers. She sat by the window, looking out at the gardens, thinking about Thomas, working at the Liverpool docks, thinking of him for 15 years, dying alone without ever seeing her again. She thought about the life they might have had in another world, a world where class and circumstance didn't matter, where love could be simple and uncomplicated. She thought about growing old with him, having his children, waking up every morning to his gray eyes and gentle smile. But that world didn't exist. In this world, love had required murder. Freedom had required damnation, and happiness had required forgetting, or at least pretending to forget, the terrible price that had been paid. Catherine placed Thomas's final letter with his first one, tucking them both into a small wooden box along with the pressed rose. She hid the box in the back of her wardrobe, behind her winter gowns, where no one would find it. It would be her secret, her burden, her memorial to a love that could never be spoken of. The years continued to pass. Catherine's children grew and married and gave her grandchildren. Her husband's health began to fail in his later years, and she cared for him with genuine tenderness. When he died, she mourned him honestly, for he had been a good man who had never deserved a wife with a divided heart. As a widow, Catherine lived quietly in the countryside, surrounded by her family, respected in the community, apparently at peace. No one knew about the box hidden in her wardrobe, about the letters she read on sleepless nights, about the ghost who had haunted her for 40 years. When Catherine was 63 years old, she fell ill with pneumonia. Her children gathered around her bedside, and the local physician shook his head gravely. She was old, he said, and weak, and it was likely she would not recover. Catherine accepted this news with calm. She had lived a long life, longer than she had any right to expect. She had known love, had raised children, had done some good in the world despite the darkness in her past. She was ready to face whatever judgment awaited her. On her last day, when her breathing had become labored and her children sat vigil around her bed, Catherine's eldest daughter noticed her trying to speak. She leaned close, straining to hear her mother's whispered words. "The box," Catherine breathed. "In my wardrobe. Burn it. Don't read. Just burn it," her daughter promised, and Catherine closed her eyes, content at last. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Lady Catherine Hertford died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the family that loved her. The next morning, Catherine's daughter found the wooden box exactly where her mother had said. She was tempted to open it, to read whatever secrets her mother had kept for so many years. But she had made a promise, and she honored it. She built a fire in the hearth and watched as the box and its contents burned. The letters curled and blackened, Thomas's words disappearing into ash. The pressed rose crumbled into dust. The last physical evidence of their love was consumed by flames, leaving nothing behind but smoke and memories. Catherine's daughter wondered briefly what story lay behind those letters. What passion had driven her mother's mysterious youth? She had glimpsed a few words before the flames took them. "I love you. I will always love you." Worth everything, worth the guilt, the loneliness, the damnation. What had her mother done? What secrets had she carried all those years? Catherine's daughter would never know, and perhaps that was for the best. Some loves, she thought, were too dark to be spoken of, too twisted to be understood. They could only be carried in silence, hidden in the shadows of respectable lives, cherished and mourned in equal measure. Catherine was buried in the churchyard beside her husband, under a simple headstone that read, "Lady Catherine Hertford, beloved wife and mother, 1803, 1866, rest in peace. The funeral was well attended. Her children spoke of her charity, her kindness, her devotion to family. The vicar praised her as a model of Christian virtue and womanly grace. No one mentioned the darkness she had carried, the terrible secret that had shaped her life. In Liverpool, in a pauper's cemetery near the docks, there was another grave, marked only with a simple wooden cross that had weathered 15 years of rain and wind. The name carved into it was barely legible now: Thomas Blackwell. No one visited that grave. No one laid flowers there or said prayers for his soul. He had died alone and been buried among strangers, another nameless laborer who had lived and worked and died without leaving a mark on the world. But in death, as in life, he was connected to Catherine by invisible threads of love and guilt and shared darkness. Their souls were bound together by what they had done, by the terrible choice he had made, and she had accepted. Whether that bond would follow them into whatever came next, whether they would find each other in some afterlife and finally be free to love without shadows, no one could say. What remained certain was this: a young nobleman's daughter had once loved a poor servant so desperately that she had been willing to accept murder as the price of her freedom. And that servant had loved her so completely that he had been willing to damn his soul, to become a killer, to spend the rest of his life in exile and guilt, all to save her from a monster's hands. It was not a love that poets would celebrate or that ballads would commemorate. It was too dark for that, too stained with blood and moral compromise. But it was love nonetheless, fierce and absolute and willing to pay any price, bear any burden, cross any line. Some would call it madness, some would call it obsession, some would call it evil, dressed up in the trappings of devotion. But those who have loved truly, desperately, without hope or reason, might recognize it for what it was: love in its most raw and dangerous form. Love that acknowledged no boundaries, respected no laws, feared no consequences. Catherine had been saved by such love, and she had spent 40 years trying to be worthy of the terrible price that had been paid for her freedom. Whether she succeeded, whether any happiness she found could justify what Thomas had done, was a question she took to her grave. In the end, perhaps that was the real tragedy of their story. Not that they could not be together, but that being together would have made the sacrifice meaningless. Thomas had damned himself so that Catherine could be free, could live, could be happy. If she had thrown away that gift to run off with him, to live as fugitives or outcasts, then his damnation would have been for nothing. So, they had lived separate lives, carrying their shared darkness alone, never speaking of what had been done, never acknowledging the love that had required murder. And perhaps that was its own kind of sacrifice: to love someone so much that you let them go. Let them build a life with someone else. Let them find whatever happiness they could, even though it meant living without them. Thomas had given Catherine her life, and Catherine had honored that gift by living it as best she could, by being happy when possible, by building something good on the foundation of murder he had laid for her. It was a twisted kind of love story, dark and morally compromised and ultimately tragic. But it was real. It was true. And it had shaped two lives completely. From that first meeting in a spring garden to those final moments when Catherine whispered her last request and Thomas fell from a crane into oblivion. The world moved on, as it always does. Catherine's grandchildren grew up never knowing the truth about their grandmother's past. Thornfield Manor eventually passed to another family. The Duke of Blackmore's estate was inherited by a distant cousin. Liverpool's docks continued to bustle with commerce and labour, and in quiet churchyards, separated by hundreds of miles, two bodies lay in the earth, their souls finally at rest, their story lost to time. A blonde noblewoman of 22 and a dark-haired servant of 24, who had once loved so deeply that they had been willing to sacrifice everything, to risk damnation itself, for a chance at freedom. Some loves are like that. They burn so hot, they consume everything around them, leaving only ash and memory. They demand too much, cost too much, hurt too much. But to those who experience them, to those who live through the fire and carry the scars forever after, they are worth it. Catherine had thought so. Even at the end, even knowing everything that had happened, everything they had done and lost and suffered, she had thought it worth it. Thomas had saved her. And that was all that mattered. The rest, the guilt, the separation, the lifetime of secrets, was just the price they paid for love. And compared to what she had been saved from, compared to the horror of marriage to the Duke of Blackmore, that price seemed almost reasonable. Almost. On dark nights, when the wind howled and the rain fell, Catherine had sometimes wondered if the Duke's ghost haunted Blackmore Hall, if he wandered those empty corridors seeking revenge against the servant who had poisoned him and the bride who had escaped him. She had wondered if God would punish them for what they had done, if there was any forgiveness for murder committed in the name of love. She never found answers to those questions. She simply lived with them, carrying them as part of the burden she had accepted when she let Thomas go to Blackmore Hall with poison in his pocket. And in the end, when death came for her at last, she went willingly, almost hopefully, thinking that perhaps, in whatever came next, she might finally see Thomas again, might finally tell him face to face that she understood, that she was grateful, that his dark devotion had been the truest love she had ever known. Whether such a reunion awaited them, whether murderers and their accomplices could find peace in the afterlife, was beyond mortal knowing. But Catherine died believing it was possible, and that belief had sustained her through 40 years of respectable widowhood and secret mourning.